He thought she came alone, and he made sure everyone noticed. Ryan Whitmore's smirk cutting through the golden glow of the gala, as whispers followed Claire across the marble floor in her simple black dress. No diamonds, no escort, just silence. Exactly how he remembered breaking her, until she didn't flinch, didn't explain, only watched as he bragged about the biggest deal of his life. The room turning toward the entrance as the doors opened and Sebastian Cole stepped in, eyes locked on hers, crossing the distance without hesitation before taking her hand like it had always been his. And that was the moment Ryan realized the deal, the power, the night, had never belonged to him at all. You really came alone? Ryan Whitmore's voice carried just enough to turn heads, a polished blade hidden inside a casual question. And for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to pause with him, crystal chandeliers casting gold across marble floors while conversations thinned into a low hum. Waiting for her answer, Claire Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd in a simple black dress that didn't try to compete with the glitter around her. No diamonds at her throat, no man at her side, just quiet composure that felt almost out of place among tailored suits and silk gowns. She could feel the weight of their curiosity, their quiet judgment measuring her absence of status like it was something visible, something lacking. Ryan stepped closer, his fiancée on his arm, radiant in red and confidence. The kind of confidence that came from believing you had already won. His smile softened for the audience, but his eyes did not. I thought you might at least pretend things were better, he added lightly, as if it were. Concern, as if he hadn't engineered this moment by making sure she was invited, by making sure people remembered who she used to be. Claire didn't answer right away, her fingers resting lightly against the stem of a champagne glass, cool and steady despite the warmth rising in her chest. The room smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished wood, a world she once navigated beside him, back when her silence had meant compliance, back when his voice had filled every empty space. She remembered how easily he used to rewrite reality, how he turned her patience into weakness, her loyalty into something small, something disposable. And for a brief second the past pressed him like a shadow. But it didn't stay, because this time she wasn't standing there waiting to be chosen. She wasn't trying to keep up with his world. She was simply observing it. Ryan mistook her silence for hesitation, for the same quiet defeat he had walked away from months ago. He chuckled softly, turning slightly so others could hear. Some things don't change, he said, as if he were narrating her life for the room, as if he still owned the story. A few polite laughs followed, thin and careful, the kind people give when they don't want to be on the wrong side of power. Claire finally lifted her gaze, not to argue, not to defend, just to look at him the way you look at something that no longer defines you. And in that look there was no anger, no plea, only distance, something he didn't recognize. Something that unsettled him for a fraction of a second before he brushed it off. Because in his mind, she was exactly where he expected her to be, alone, diminished, irrelevant. And for a moment the illusion held. The room continued to orbit him, his voice, his presence, his carefully constructed victory. But Claire didn't move, didn't leave, didn't correct him. She simply stood there, as if she knew something no one else did, as if she was waiting, not for approval, not for escape, but for something inevitable, something already set in motion. And somewhere beyond the closed doors of the ballroom, footsteps echoed, faintly against polished floors, unheard by most, unnoticed by all, but drawing closer with every second. And Claire, still holding her silence, did not turn around. The music swelled again, as if the room had decided the moment was over, as if Ryan's version of the story had already been accepted, and conversations slowly stitched themselves back together around him. But the air near Claire felt different, thinner, like something unseen was about to break through. She shifted her weight slightly, the heel of her shoe soft against the polished marble, her reflection faint beneath her, steady and unshaken. Someone approached from her left, a woman she used to know, polished smile, careful eyes. "Claire, it has been a while," she said, her tone balanced between curiosity and quiet pity. "Are you still working on those small projects?" The pause lingered longer than necessary, heavy with implication. Claire met her gaze with calm simplicity. "I am working," she replied. Nothing more, nothing less, and somehow that answer unsettled more than any explanation could have. Across the room, Ryan's laughter rose again. Louder this time, confident, effortless. He had always been good at filling space, at shaping perception. This deal changes everything, he was saying to a small circle gathered around him. Voices of investors and board members blending into approval. The kind of backing most companies never even get close to. His fiancée leaned into him, fingers resting lightly against his arm, her smile bright, almost triumphant, as if she already saw the future unfolding exactly the way he described it. Claire heard every word, not because she was listening for it, but because it echoed too clearly the confidence, the certainty, the same tone he used when he used to promise things that only benefited him. She remembered sitting across from him years ago at a kitchen island that gleamed just as brightly as this floor, hearing him say, "Trust me," as if trust was something he could demand instead of earn. She remembered how easily she had believed him, how quietly she had adjusted herself to fit into the version of life he wanted, smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. The memory passed through her now without weight, like a shadow that no longer belonged to her. A server moved past with a tray of champagne flutes, the soft clink of glass marking time. Claire reached for one, her hand steady, her breath even. She was aware of the glances, the subtle shifts of attention, people trying to place her, trying to understand why she was still standing there instead of slipping away. Ryan noticed it too, the way the room had not completely released her presence, and something in him tightened, just enough to sharpen his tone. "Some people," he said, not looking at her directly but making sure she could hear, never really move forward, they just linger. A few nods followed, quiet agreement wrapped in politeness. Claire lifted the glass to her lips, but did not drink, her eyes drifting briefly toward the entrance of the ballroom, as if drawn by something beyond the conversation, beyond the noise, beyond him. Ryan followed her gaze instinctively, then dismissed it just as quickly because, in his mind, there was nothing there worth noticing, nothing that could interrupt the narrative he had already built. And yet Claire did not look back at him, did not respond, did not defend. She simply held that stillness, that quiet certainty, as if she already knew the moment he was so carefully controlling was no longer his. And somewhere beyond the closed doors, the faint echo of approaching footsteps grew closer, steady, deliberate, unstoppable, though no one in the room had realized it. Yet the doors opened without announcement, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a subtle shift in the room, a ripple that moved faster than sound. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips, and for a brief moment the entire ballroom seemed to breathe in at once. Claire felt it before she saw him. The change in energy, the way attention redirected without being told. Her gaze steady as it followed the quiet current toward the entrance, and there he was. Sebastian Cole, not surrounded, not performing, simply walking in with the kind of presence that did not ask for recognition because it already owned it, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression calm, focused, as if he had already chosen exactly where he was going. Ryan's voice faded as people turned, confusion flickering across his face as the attention he had been holding so tightly slipped from his grasp. "Is that?" someone whispered, but the name did not need to be finished. It traveled, on its own through the room, recognition spreading in silence. Claire did not move, did not call out, did not signal. She simply stood where she was as Sebastian closed the distance between them, each step measured, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the moment. Ryan watched, the confidence that had defined him moments ago beginning to fracture, because this was not part of the narrative, this was not something he had planned. And when Sebastian finally stopped in front of Claire, the room fell completely still. No music, no whispers, just the quiet weight of anticipation. He looked at her first, not at the crowd, not at Ryan, only at her. And there was something in that look, something certain, something known. "I was wondering how long you would let them talk," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying without effort. Claire's lips curved slightly, not into a smile for the room, but something softer, something private. "I was giving them time," she replied, And then, without hesitation, without explanation, Sebastian reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers with quiet familiarity, not a grand gesture, not a display, just a simple, undeniable connection that shifted everything in the room at once. The air seemed to change, heavier, sharper. Ryan felt it like a sudden loss of ground beneath him, his mind racing to catch up, to understand what he was seeing, what it meant. His fiancée's grip tightened slightly on his arm, uncertainty replacing her earlier confidence, because this was no longer a scene they controlled. Sebastian did not look at Ryan immediately, did not acknowledge him as the center of anything. Instead, he turned slightly toward the small circle of investors Ryan had been addressing, his tone calm, almost conversational. "I apologize for being late," he said. "I wanted to make sure everything was finalized before I arrived." The words landed softly, but their meaning spread like a shockwave. Confusion flickered into realization across a few faces. The deal, the backing, the opportunity Ryan had been celebrating, it was not his. It had never been. Ryan opened his mouth, searching for control, for something to reclaim the moment, but no words came. Because for the first time he was no longer the one defining the story. And as he stood there, watching Claire's hand in Sebastian's, watching the room shift around her instead of him, one truth settled in with quiet, devastating clarity. She had never been alone. He had just never understood what that meant. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like something carefully held together finally giving way. A low murmur rising through the ballroom as people recalculated everything they thought they understood just moments ago. Eyes shifting from Ryan to Claire, from Claire to Sebastian, trying to piece together a narrative that no longer fit. Ryan felt it in the way no one was looking at him anymore. Not with admiration, not with certainty, but with something closer to doubt, the kind that spreads quietly but changes everything. He straightened slightly, forcing a breath, searching for control in a situation that had already slipped beyond him. "I think there has been some misunderstanding," he said, his voice measured, careful, as if the right tone could restore order, as if he could still frame the moment to his advantage. Sebastian turned his attention to him then, not with hostility, not with challenge, just a calm acknowledgement that felt far more unsettling. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied evenly, his hand still holding Claire's, steady, unshaken. "The investment you were referring to earlier has already been finalized." The words landed with quiet precision, and for a second Ryan did not respond, because the meaning took time to settle, like a realization that resisted being accepted. "Finalized by whom?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could refine it, before he could protect himself from the answer. Sebastian did not hesitate. "By her," he said, a slight nod toward Claire, simple, direct, undeniable. The shift was immediate, visible in the way heads turned fully toward her now, not as a figure of curiosity, not as a remnant of Ryan's past, but as the center of something far larger, something that had been present all along without announcement. Claire did not step forward, did not claim the moment. She simply stood there with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, as if this reveal changed nothing about who she was, only what others were finally able to see. Ryan's expression tightened, the confidence that once defined him now replaced with something sharper, more uncertain. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, because the version of Claire he held onto did not include this, could not include this. Sebastian's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, just factual. "It is already done," he said. "The agreement was signed this afternoon. The timeline settled like a final piece of the puzzle." Claire had not walked into the room hoping for validation. She had walked in knowing the outcome, knowing the moment would come whether anyone understood it or not. The room adjusted again, conversations reshaping, alliances quietly shifting in the wake of new information. Ryan felt the distance growing, not physical, but something deeper, something he could not reach across. His fiancée's hand slipped slightly from his arm, her attention no longer anchored to him in the same way, because power, once revealed, has a way of redrawing every line. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm, even not raised, not sharpened. "You always believed being loud meant being in control," she said. her eyes meeting Ryan's with a clarity that left no space for denial. But you never learned how to listen. There was no accusation in her tone, no anger, just a statement, something observed and left behind. Ryan opened his mouth, but whatever response he might have had no longer carried the same weight. Not in this room, not in this moment, because the story he had been telling had already ended, and no one was waiting to hear his version anymore. Claire shifted her hand slightly in. Sebastian's, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but intentional, grounded, present, as if reminding herself that this was real, that she was here not as who she used to be, but as who she had become, and as the room continued to orbit around a new center, one truth remained clear in the quiet space between them. She had not returned to prove anything to him. She had returned because she no longer needed to. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not with spectacle, but in the quiet recalibration of every glance and every whispered assumption. Claire could feel it in the subtle way people now stepped slightly closer instead of away, in the careful attention replacing casual dismissal, in the absence of the pity that had once followed her like a shadow. And yet she did not move to claim any of it. She did not adjust her posture or raise her chin. She remained exactly as she had been, composed, present, untouched by the change that surrounded her. Sebastian's hand still steady in hers, not guiding, not controlling. Simply there, a quiet anchor in the center of a room that had lost its balance. Ryan stood a few feet away, but the distance between them felt immeasurable now, not because of space, but because of everything that had been revealed and everything that had been misunderstood, his mind searching for something to hold on to, some version of control he could still salvage. But every path led back to the same realization, that the narrative he had built, the one where he stood at the center, had never included the truth. His fiancée shifted beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful silence, her attention no longer fixed on him, but drifting toward the gravity that had quietly taken over the room. Ryan noticed it. Of course he did. The way the world responded when power changed hands, he had always been sensitive to that, had built his life around it, but this time he was not the one holding it, and that absence pressed heavier than any confrontation could have. Claire finally withdrew her hand from Sebastian's, not abruptly, not as a rejection, but with the same calm intention that had defined her every movement that evening. She picked up her glass again, the faint reflection of light catching along its rim. And for a moment she simply stood there, as if allowing the room to settle around a new reality. Then she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the faces that had once looked through her, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet clarity, the kind that comes from understanding that you no longer need to be seen to know your own worth. "Congratulations on your deal," she said, her voice directed toward Ryan. Even, sincere, but carrying a meaning that extended beyond the words. He flinched, just barely, because for the first time the phrase did not belong to him, did not affirm him. It echoed differently now, hollow, misplaced. He tried to respond, to recover some version of himself that still fit in this room. But the words felt unfamiliar, disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of him. Claire did not wait for his answer. She did not need it. She had not come for acknowledgement or apology. She had come because she had already moved beyond both. Sebastian glanced at her, a subtle question in his eyes, not about the room, not about Ryan, but about her, and she gave a small nod, a decision made without hesitation. Together they began to walk, not away in retreat, not in escape, but forward through the same space that had once diminished her, now parting quietly without resistance. Conversations resuming in softer tones behind them, the weight of the moment settling into memory. Ryan remained where he was, watching, not with anger, not even with regret, but with something far more difficult to define, something that came from realizing too late that the person he thought he understood had never truly been seen at all. And as Claire moved toward the exit, the lights reflecting gently against the glass doors ahead, one truth lingered in the stillness she left behind. She had not needed to prove anything to change the room. She had only needed to become someone who no longer belonged to it. The night air outside felt cooler than it should have, or maybe it was just the absence of that room, the absence of eyes measuring, voices layering over each other, expectations pressing in from every direction. Claire stepped onto the wide stone terrace just beyond the glass doors, the city. Stretching out below in a quiet glow of distant headlights and scattered windows, a world that moved without needing to prove anything to anyone. She paused there, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the railing, grounding herself in something real, something steady. Sebastian followed without urgency, giving her space without stepping away, his presence calm, unintrusive, as if he understood that this moment belonged to her more than anyone else. The muffled sound of the gala behind them faded into something distant, irrelevant. And for the first time that evening, Claire allowed herself to exhale fully, not the controlled breath she had been holding all night, but something deeper, something that released what had been building quietly beneath her composure. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She simply felt clear, like a window that had finally been opened after years of stale air. "You handled that exactly the way I thought you would," Sebastian said after a moment, his voice low, steady, not filled with praise, just recognition. Claire glanced at him briefly, a small, almost amused shift in her expression. "I was not sure how I would handle it," she admitted, her voice softer now, less guarded. "I only knew I was not going to be who I used to be." The honesty in that statement settled between them, simple and unadorned. Sebastian nodded slightly, as if that answer made perfect sense, because it did, because everything about the way she had stood in that room had already said it without words. Claire's gaze drifted back toward the glass doors, where faint silhouettes still moved inside, figures continuing conversations that would inevitably reshape themselves around what had just happened. Ryan was somewhere in that space, still processing, still trying to reconstruct something that had already collapsed, and yet she felt no pull toward it. No unfinished thread, no need to return. That part of her life no longer held weight. It existed, but did not define her. "He thought he understood everything," she said quietly, more to herself than to Sebastian, "but he never saw what mattered." Sebastian followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. "Most people only see what confirms what they already believe," he replied. "It is easier that way." Claire considered that, the truth of it settling without resistance, because she had lived inside that exact dynamic, shaped by it, diminished by it, until she chose not to be anymore. A faint breeze moved across the terrace, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying with it the distant hum of the city, something alive, something ongoing, something that did not pause for anyone's story. She straightened slightly, not as a performance, not for anyone watching, but as a natural shift, a quiet alignment with who she had become. Sebastian glanced at his watch briefly, then back at her. "There is a dinner tomorrow with the board," he said, not as a command, not as an expectation, just an option placed gently in front of her. "You do not have to attend if you would rather not." Claire's lips curved slightly again, this time with a hint of certainty. "I will be there," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no second-guessing, just a simple decision rooted in something steady and unshakable. Sebastian nodded once, as if that answer had always been the one he expected, and for a moment they stood there in silence, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full in a way that did not need to be filled with words. Behind them the doors remained closed, the world they had stepped out of continuing without them. And ahead, the city lights stretched into the distance, open, unclaimed, waiting, and Claire did not look back again. The drive back was quiet, not empty, but settled, the kind of silence that follows a storm, not because everything is over, but because something has shifted permanently. The city lights moved past in long reflections across the window, stretching and dissolving as the car glided through late evening traffic. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her posture relaxed for the first time that night, her hand resting loosely in her lap instead of gripping something to stay grounded. She watched the world outside without really focusing on it, her mind not racing, not replaying the scene, just still, and that stillness felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a room that used to be filled with noise and realizing it had finally gone quiet. Sebastian did not interrupt it, his attention steady on the road, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other relaxed, as if he understood that this moment did not need to be filled with conversation. Eventually, Claire spoke, not to break the silence, but because the thought had settled enough to be said. I used to think nights like that would define everything that came after. Her voice was calm, reflective, without the weight it once would have carried. Sebastian glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. And now? He asked, not pushing, just allowing space. Claire considered the question for a second, watching a line of headlights pass in the opposite direction, each one moving with its own destination, its own purpose. Now it feels like it was just a moment, she said, and there was something steady in that realization, something that marked how far she had come without needing to measure it. Sebastian nodded slightly, as if that answer aligned with what he had already seen in her. The car slowed as they approached a red light, the glow casting a soft wash of color across the dashboard. Claire's reflection faintly visible in the glass, but it was not the same reflection she used to search for validation in. It was simply her, unchanged by the room they had left, unchanged by the people still inside it. And that was the difference. The light turned green, and the car moved forward again, seamless, uninterrupted. You knew he would be there tonight, Sebastian said after a moment. Not a question, just an observation. Claire gave a small nod. Yes, she replied. I almost did not come. The admission was quiet, but it carried the weight of a decision that could have gone differently. Sebastian did not respond immediately, giving her the space to continue if she wanted, and she did. But then I realized something, she added, her gaze steady now. Not drifting. Avoiding him would not have been strength. It would have been permission. The words settled between them with clarity, simple and unarguable. Sebastian's expression softened. Slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the thought behind it. You did not give him that, he said, and Claire shook her head gently. No, she replied. I did not. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into something more distant, more manageable. The buildings here lower, the lights softer, everything feeling less performative, more real. Claire leaned back slightly, her shoulders no longer carrying the tension she had walked in with hours ago. And for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge what the night had actually been. Not a confrontation, not a victory, but a closing, something that had been open for too long finally settling in a place without needing force, without needing noise, just done. And as the car continued forward, moving steadily into a part of the city that did not know her past, did not care about old narratives or shifting power, one quiet truth remained. She had not changed the world she left behind. She had simply outgrown it. Morning arrived without urgency, the soft gray light filtering through tall windows that overlooked a quieter part of the city, far removed from the polished noise of the night before. Claire stood barefoot on the cool hardwood floor of her apartment, a mug of coffee warming her hands, the faint aroma grounding her in a present that felt steady, unshaken. She had not woken up thinking about the gala. Not immediately. And that in itself felt like a quiet victory. Not because it had not mattered, but because it no longer defined the shape of her thoughts. Her phone rested on the kitchen counter, silent at first, then gradually lighting up with notifications that arrived in waves. Messages from unfamiliar numbers, emails marked urgent, headlines already forming narratives she had not asked for. She glanced at it once, then looked away, taking another slow sip instead, choosing not to let the outside world dictate the pace of her morning. Across the room, a thin stack of documents sat neatly aligned on the dining table. Contracts finalized, signatures placed with intention, decisions made long before anyone in that ballroom realized what was unfolding. This had never been about a single night. It had been built in quiet, in meetings that no one attended for attention, in conversations that did not need an audience, in choices made when no one was watching. And that was why it held, because it was real, because it did not rely on perception. Her phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, and eventually she walked over, setting her mug down before picking it up, her expression unchanged as she scrolled through the screen. There were articles already speculating, already connecting names, already reframing the story to fit what people understood of power and success. Ryan's name appeared more than once, tied to confusion, to questions about the deal that had slipped out of his control. Claire read it without reaction, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, just awareness, because it was no longer personal. It was simply the natural consequence of something that had already been decided. A message from Sebastian appeared near the top, brief, direct. Board meeting moved to 11. I will meet you there, she read it once, then typed a simple response. I will be there. Nothing more, nothing less, the kind of exchange that did not need explanation, that carried understanding without elaboration. She set the phone back down, letting the noise of the outside world settle into the background where it belonged, and turned her attention to the documents on the table, flipping through them with calm precision, her mind already shifting forward, already aligning with what came next. There was no hesitation in her movements, no second guessing, just clarity, a quiet sense of direction that had replaced the uncertainty she used to carry. A reflection caught her eye briefly in the glass of the window, and she paused, not out of doubt, but recognition. This was not the version of herself that had once stood in rooms waiting to be acknowledged. This was someone who built her own place at the table and did not need permission to sit. The city outside continued to move, traffic flowing, people heading toward their own lives, unaware of the shift that had happened, unaware of the story that had quietly turned overnight. And Claire felt no need to announce it, no need to claim it, because what mattered had already been set in motion. And as she gathered the documents, preparing to step into a day that would not revolve around the past she had left behind, one truth settled with quiet certainty. The night before had not been the moment everything changed, it had simply been. The moment everyone else finally saw it, the boardroom was quieter than the ballroom. But the silence here carried a different kind of weight, not judgment, not curiosity, but expectation, the kind that settled over polished wood and glass walls, overlooking the city like something measured and deliberate. Claire stepped inside without hesitation, her heels soft against the floor, the early light stretching across the long table where a handful of executives were already seated. There, conversations tapering off as she entered, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that the room had shifted to include her. Sebastian stood near the far end, reviewing a set of documents with calm focus. And when he looked up, there was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, as if this moment had always been part of the plan. Claire placed her folder neatly in front of an open seat, her movements precise, unhurried. She did not rush to fill the silence, did not attempt to command attention, because she did not need to. The room naturally adjusted, chairs shifting slightly, eyes settling, a quiet understanding forming without being spoken. One of the board members, an older man with a measured gaze, leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "Miss Whitmore, we have reviewed the final structure of the agreement," he said, not dismissive, not overly impressed, simply factual. "There are a few points we would like to clarify before proceeding." Claire nodded once, her expression composed. "Open, of course," she replied, her voice even, grounded, and as the discussion began, it unfolded without friction. Questions met with clear answers, concerns addressed without defensiveness. She spoke not to impress, not to dominate, but to align, her words measured, precise, built on decisions that had already been made long before this meeting. Sebastian watched quietly, not intervening, not redirecting, allowing her space to define her own position. And it became evident quickly that she did not need support to hold it. Across the table, another executive adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the projections before looking back at her. "You anticipated the market response with unusual accuracy," he noted, a hint of curiosity beneath his professionalism. Claire did not react to the compliment, did not deflect it either. "It was not anticipation," she said calmly. "It was preparation." The distinction settled into the room, subtle, but significant because it reframed everything, not luck, not timing, but intention. And with that, the tone shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that the remaining questions became less about doubt and more about confirmation. The meeting moved forward, details aligning, signatures prepared, decisions finalized with the kind of efficiency that comes from clarity rather than pressure. And, as it concluded, there was no applause, no overt acknowledgement, just a quiet consensus that what had been set in motion would continue exactly as intended. Claire gathered her documents, her posture unchanged, her focus already moving ahead, not lingering in the validation of the moment, because it was never the goal. As people began to stand, small conversations forming in clusters, one of the board members approached her briefly, offering a nod that carried more weight than words. "We look forward to working with you," he said. And Claire met his gaze with the same steady composure. "As do I," she replied, simple, direct, and as she turned slightly, her reflection caught again in a glass wall behind her, framed against the skyline beyond. There was no hesitation in the way she saw herself now. No searching for confirmation, only recognition, because this room, like the one before it, did not define her. It simply revealed what had already been there. And as she stepped forward into the next phase of something she had built quietly, deliberately, without needing an audience, one truth remained constant. She was no longer stepping into spaces that judged her. She was stepping into spaces that aligned with who she had already become. The hallway outside the boardroom felt almost too quiet after the steady rhythm of decisions and measured voices, the kind of quiet that followed clarity rather than tension. Claire walked alongside the glass wall that stretched the length of the corridor, the city visible below in sharp midday light. Everything defined, everything moving with purpose, her reflection keeping pace. Beside her, no longer something she studied, just something that existed without question. Sebastian stepped out a moment later, the door closing softly behind him, and for a second neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be rushed. "They did not expect you," he said finally, his tone observational rather than impressed. Claire's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement. "Most people do not expect what they never took the time to understand," she replied, her voice calm, even, and there was no edge to it, no bitterness left behind, only a simple truth that no longer carried weight. Sebastian glanced at her briefly, then toward the city beyond the glass. "You changed the direction of that entire room without raising your voice," he said, and this time there was a hint of recognition beneath the statement. Claire shook her head gently. "No," she said, "I did not change it. I just did not allow it to define me." The distinction settled between them, subtle but important, because it explained everything without needing to expand on it. A pause followed, filled not with uncertainty, but with the quiet understanding of two people who did not need to fill space unnecessarily. Further down the corridor, a few members of the board lingered in conversation, their voices low, but their glances occasionally shifting toward Claire. Not with curiosity now, but with measured respect, the kind that forms when something proves itself without needing to ask for acknowledgement. Claire noticed it, of course she did, but she did not respond to it, did not adjust her pace or posture, because it was not something she needed to hold on to. It was simply something that existed in the moment. "Ryan has been calling," Sebastian added after a moment, his tone unchanged, as if mentioning the weather. Claire did not stop walking, but there was a slight shift in her expression. Not tension, not avoidance, just awareness. "I assumed he would," she said quietly, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty about what that meant. Sebastian studied her for a brief second, not intrusively, just enough to understand. "Do you want to take the call?" he asked, not as a suggestion, not as an expectation, simply as an option. Claire considered it for a moment, her gaze drifting ahead toward the end of the corridor where the light was strongest, and for a second the past and the present seemed to align in that space. The version of her that might have answered immediately, might have sought closure, explanation, something unresolved, and the version of her now, standing in a place she had built without him, without needing anything from him at all. She reached in her bag, her movements calm, deliberate, pulling out her phone as the screen lit up again with his name. the sound of it faint but persistent. She looked at it for a second, not with emotion, not with resistance, just recognition, and then, without urgency, without hesitation, she silenced it, the screen going dark in her hand as easily as the connection between who she had been and who she was now. Sebastian did not react, did not comment, because he did not need to. The decision had already been made, and it did not require explanation. Claire slipped the phone back into her bag, her posture unchanged, her steps steady as she continued forward, leaving the corridor, the boardroom, the unanswered call behind her without a second glance. And as the doors at the end of the hall opened into the brightness of the day, one quiet truth followed her without weight. Some chapters do not end with words. They end with silence that no longer needs to be broken. The afternoon settled into a quiet rhythm that did not demand attention, the kind of steady movement that followed decisions already made. Claire sat at her desk near the wide window, sunlight stretching across the surface in long, defined lines, the city below continuing its constant motion, unaware of the shifts that had already taken place above it. Her laptop open, documents aligned, everything in front of her structured with intention rather than urgency. She moved through the work without hesitation, each action deliberate, each choice clear. Not because it was easy, but because it was no longer clouded by doubt. Her phone remained silent on the corner of the desk, the earlier calls no longer appearing, the absence of them almost more noticeable than their presence had been. But she did not reach for it, did not check, did not wonder, because there was nothing left there that required her attention. Across the room, a faint reflection of her moved in the glass, mirroring her posture, steady, composed, unchanged. And for a brief moment she paused, not out of uncertainty, but awareness, recognizing the quiet difference between who she had been and who she was now. The version of herself that once waited for permission to move forward, to speak, to decide, and the one who no longer needed any of those things. A soft knock came at the door, subtle but clear, pulling her attention back to the present. "Come in," she said, her voice even, grounded. The door opened just enough for an assistant to step in, holding a tablet, her expression professional but slightly hesitant. "There is someone asking to see you," she said carefully, as if unsure how the request would be received. Claire looked up, not immediately responding, giving the moment space. "Did they schedule an appointment?" she asked, her tone neutral, not dismissive, simply factual. The assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "No, but he insisted," she said. "He said it was important." The words hung lightly in the room. Not urgent, not pressing, just information. Claire held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Who is it?" she asked, already knowing the answer before it was spoken. The assistant glanced briefly at the screen, then back at her. "Ryan Whitmore," she said, and the name settled into the space without impact, without disruption. Like something that no longer carried weight, Claire did not react immediately, did not shift in her seat or change her expression. She simply let the moment exist as it was, then looked back down at the document in front of her, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the page, grounding her in the present rather than the past. "Does he have a meeting scheduled with anyone else here?" she asked after a second. The assistant shook her head. "No," she replied. "He said he only wants to speak with you." Claire exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of hesitation, just a quiet release of something that no longer needed to be held. She closed the document in front of her, aligning it neatly with the others, then finally looked up, her gaze clear, steady. "Give me 5 minutes," she said, her voice calm, controlled, not rushed. The assistant nodded and stepped back out, closing the door gently behind her, and for a moment the room returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried a different weight, a different kind of anticipation. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond it. And in that reflection, she saw not the past approaching her, but herself choosing how to meet it. And as the minutes passed without urgency, one quiet truth settled into place. This time, the conversation would not define her, because this time she would decide how it ended. The 5 minutes passed without resistance. each second settling into place with the same quiet certainty that carried her through the night before. Claire remained seated for a moment longer after the clock marked the time, not out of hesitation, but intention, allowing herself to enter the moment fully aware, fully present. She stood then, smoothing the edge of her jacket with a small, precise motion, not as preparation, but as alignment, the reflection in the glass beside her steady, unchanged, and when she moved toward the door, her steps were measured, not rushed, not delayed, simply deliberate. The hallway outside remained calm, the distant hum of the office continuing as if nothing had shifted, as if this meeting was just another appointment on a schedule. The assistant glanced up briefly as Claire approached, offering a subtle nod before gesturing toward the waiting area. And there he was, Ryan Whitmore, standing near the window, his posture rigid, his expression caught somewhere between urgency and restraint. He turned the moment he heard her steps, the recognition immediate, but different from the night before, stripped of performance, stripped of audience. Just two people standing in a space that did not amplify anything. Claire stopped a few feet away, not closing the distance, not creating it either, just allowing it to exist naturally between them. "You wanted to see me," she said, her voice even, calm, not cold, not warm, simply clear. Ryan took a breath, as if preparing for something he had not fully rehearsed, his eyes searching her face, not for weakness, not for familiarity, but for something he could still recognize. "I needed to talk to you," he said, the words less controlled than before, less certain, and for a moment the silence that followed held more weight than anything he had said. Claire did not interrupt it, did not rush to fill it. She simply waited, giving him space not out of obligation, but because she no longer felt the need to control how he used it. "I did not know," he added finally, the sentence incomplete, fragile, as if he expected it to carry meaning on its own. Claire's expression did not change, not dismissive, not sympathetic, just steady. "No," she replied quietly. "You did not." And there was no accusation in it, no edge, just a simple acknowledgement of what had always been true. Ryan's gaze dropped for a second before returning to hers, the confidence he once carried replaced by something far more uncertain. "If I had known," he started, but the sentence did not finish, because even he seemed to understand that it no longer mattered, that whatever version of the past he was trying to reconstruct could not exist in the present she now occupied. Claire held his gaze for a moment longer, not to challenge him, not to confront him, but to make something clear without needing to say it. "It would not have changed anything," she said, her voice calm, certain, and the words landed with a finality that did not need emphasis. Ryan exhaled slowly, as if that truth had been expected but still difficult to accept. The space between them remained unchanged, not shrinking, not widening, simply holding, and for the first time, there was no attempt from him to step into it, to close it, to redefine it, because he could.